Herald and News, your news now.
The Herald and News.
Empowering the community.
Basin Views.
Herald and News, your news now. Klamath Falls, Oregon.
The Herald and News.
Podcast. Empowering the community and serving the Klamath Basin. This is the Herald and News Basin Views podcast. Greetings and welcome to Basin Views, a Herald and News podcast featuring interviews with the local experts discussing issues important to the Klamath Basin. I'm Kurt Liedtke with the Herald and News. This week we are joined by Mark Buettner, Klamath Tribes Scientist, and Don Gentry, Klamath Tribes Chairman, here to detail cultural, environmental, and economic concerns from the tribe's perspective regarding the ongoing water situation in the Klamath Basin and survival of the endangered fish that call Upper Klamath Lake home. Mark, Don, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you.
We have a lot to cover, but before we do that, I always like to get to know people a little bit better first. So, Don, could you kind of explain your background and how you've become the Klamath Tribes Chairman?
I was born a Klamath tribal member. My father, Klamath, my mom, non-native, born here in Klamath Falls. And we, through our tribal, and I've lived here most of my life. I was gone for a period of time, but I've been back here since 1969, born in 1955, and lived here for a time, then moved away. I worked in the Klamath Tribes Natural Resource Department for a number of years, and I've also done other things in Klamath Falls. Folks know me from when we had a music store, a retail musical instrument business, and so forth. But I spent the majority of my career working for the Klamath Tribes in the Natural Resource Department. I worked and became the Klamath Tribes Natural Resource Specialist before I ran for Tribal Council in 2010. I worked for the tribes for 25 years prior to that. I was around when we started actually our water sampling regime and learned how to spawn suckers when Mark was actually new to the area, or at least new to working with us in that capacity. So we have a long history together, and so I've been here. So after working for the tribes for 25 years, I came on and ran for tribal government, which we have a referendum vote. We send mail-out ballots to all of our members. And I was elected vice chairman and seated in 2010. And I ran again and as chairman, and I'm now finishing up my 6th year as chairman. Elections begin again next year in February with nominations.
So what exactly does the chairman do other than get their face in the newspaper a lot?
Well, I chair both the tribal council, which is a 10-member elected tribal council, elected the same way as me. The officers, we run for specific positions, but then there's 6 members at large, so there's 6 positions that are filled. And so I'm elected. I chair both the tribal council and also the general council. The general council are the voting members of the Klamath Tribes. So we have every 2 weeks we have a tribal council meeting of the 10 members to conduct business, and our primary responsibility is to serve the Klamath Tribes as provided through the tribal council. We oversee tribal administration of our programs. We also perform other governmental functions, develop policies, law, and overall do our best to protect the interests of the tribes. Of course, one of our responsibilities is to protect the treaty rights and resources and promote enhancing those for our members. The General Council, if we have a quorum of 50 people, we have quarterly General Council meetings, and special General Council meetings is required. So I chair that meeting also.
And joining you today, Mark has quite an interesting and extensive background in understanding fish biology, which is such an important topic right now. Mark, could you kind of give us your background?
Yes, I've got my education as in fishery biology from Humboldt State University. I got both a bachelor's and master's degree. Upon completing my education, I began my career working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of Reno, Nevada. Interestingly, worked on a similar endangered fish in that area called the kiwi, which is related to the 2 endangered suckers that we have here in the Klamath Basin. So one of the reasons why I got involved in the Klamath Basin was because of my expertise with the kiwi, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was invited to help the Klamath Tribes and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife with some early studies on the endangered fish. And so I came to the basin in 1987 and worked closely with Don and some of the other tribal technicians to work on these fish, better understand what was going on with their populations, what some of their biology was. And so then I continued to work in the basin for another 20 years, working initially with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation for 12 years in the early 90s through late 90s, and then for another 8 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Klamath Falls, also working with these fish and habitat restoration and other projects. Retiring in 2009, leaving the basin for about 5 years, and then seeing the fish weren't progressing like we had hoped, and wanted to be able to contribute to getting things on the right track. So I've been with the Klamath Tribes for a little over a year now.
You have an interesting background on this in that you worked with federal and state agencies on water issues and species issues for so long, and now you're doing so from the tribe's perspective, so you can kind of see things from both sides. How does that help you do your job now in the role as representing the Klamath Tribes as the official tribal scientist?
Having worked both on the research end, the regulatory end, I have been involved in participating in the different levels of management. From a regulatory standpoint, working as a biologist for reclamation, my role was to try to evaluate how the Klamath Irrigation Project affected these species and their habitat, and try to come up with actions and management strategies that would minimize the impacts of project operations on the health of the species. And then, for quite a number of years, I participated in trying to develop good science to base management decisions on water management, restoration, that type of thing. Working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has more direct responsibility in recovery of the species, my responsibilities were to help identify a recovery process that would lead to the species recovery. When I started, there was an old recovery plan which was out of date, didn't have the current science to base recommendations. So I helped complete a process to get a more scientifically valid and up-to-date plan to guide the recovery of the species.
Before we really delve into a lot of the issues pertaining to Klamath Tribes today, I want to get an abridged history. We could do an entire podcast just on the history of Klamath Tribes itself, but if you could give us a basic summary of what are the Klamath Tribes and its population size today.
The Klamath are three different people groups. The Klamath Usikni is what we called ourselves historically, Moatkani or the Modoc, and the Yehuskan band of Snake River Paiutes, and so we call ourselves the Klamath Modoc and Paiute people, or Yehuskan Paiute. We have 5,000, just a little over 5,200 members currently.
But what are some of the treaties established pertaining to Klamath Tribes' rights?
Prior to the Treaty of 1864, there was a lot of contact and loss of life and conflict between tribal members and the non-tribal members in the area. So there was a need for a peace treaty. I don't really believe that our leaders at the time really felt like they had much of an option, given local history and what was happening here and what people refer to as the settling of the West somehow. I believe our leaders were faced with a very difficult situation, enter into a treaty and provide something for the future of their people, or basically not be here anymore, like the Rogue River Indians and other folks. And so it wasn't like we really desired to be there. Originally we wanted to live on our land and be the native people that I think that we believe Creator wanted us to be and intended us to be. But to keep the peace, the Klamath Tribes met with leaders of the federal government, and we had 27 treaty signers, Klamath Modoc and Paiute leaders meet at Council Groves near Fort Klamath, pretty close to the old Indian Agency, just north of there, and negotiate a treaty. And in concept, I think it's always important to note that the treaties were negotiated as under the Constitution of the United States, which declares treaties to be the supreme law of the land in Article 6. So in essence, we met nation to nation. The federal government had a map and identified what they believed were lands that we had right and title to. And we agreed to cede land to the federal government. In original Aboriginal lands, I've heard different numbers floated around, but most commonly, when you look at historical documents and records and communication, we had about 22 million acres of land that the federal government determined was ours, that we had right and title to. And we ceded nearly 20 million acres of that land to the federal government to keep the peace and to benefit the U.S. citizens. For that, we were promised, it established kind of a pretty paternalistic, unique relationship, a nation within a nation. But at that time, the federal government became our trustee. In other words, they were to look out for our interests forever, and they promised health, education, benefits for what we ceded to the federal government. So that established that really unique relationship. And with that trust responsibility, that still survives today. So I think it's important to note that we weren't given anything by the federal government. Rather, we ceded lands and tried to reserve property and rights that were to be ours forever. And with that, though the language of the treaty is somewhat simple in some respects, you must assume when we retain the land, we retained it for all the purposes that we had before. To hunt, fish, trap, gather, live off the land, not be a burden to anybody, but exercise our traditions, culture, our spiritual practices. That's all assumed, provided that's within the law. Those are assumed to go with those properties. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what termination was and wasn't. But there's a federal policy that was basically designed to assimilate Native Americans into what I've heard people refer to as the greater society. A lot of the federal policies were developed to assimilate us. Other folks really believed that folks wanted what we had, our land. And prior to termination, which was an act of Congress, contrary to what people believe, the Klamath tribal members didn't vote for termination. We spoke out against it. It's clearly documented in a congressional record. Termination Act was passed. Then tribal members were given 3 years later almost 4 years later in 1958, were given an opportunity to choose to have a share of their assets in cash or to have what was left over in terms of land managed by somebody. And nearly 2/3 of our members voted to receive the cash. But I don't think people quite understand about that. I think this is important to note, that our members didn't fully know what that meant. Who was to manage those lands? We knew it wasn't going to be the federal government. How would we be involved in that? And I think what is clearly on record, tribal members were encouraged to take the cash. There's written documentation by the representatives from the BIA that timber management wouldn't be a very good investment into the future. There was actually a real proactive effort to encourage people to take the cash. But a lot of confusion. And even some of our own members felt when they voted one way or another that they actually voted for termination, but that's not the case. When the tribes were terminated, we lost a significant part of our land. Later, the, quote, remaining members lost their land when they were disgruntled and wanted to get the U.S. Bank out of our hair, so to speak, because we were frustrated with their management. When they voted to get them out, they didn't realize that would start the condemnation proceedings and the taking of the land by the federal government and payment at that time. The tribes were terminated, but our rights to hunt, fish, trap, and gather weren't terminated. That was affirmed in the courts in the Kimball versus Callaghan case, where the state of Oregon took tribal members to court saying, hey, you're no longer Indians anymore, you don't have a reservation, you don't have any rights. That's the perspective that they came. Tribal members continued to say, hey, we never lost our rights, we were never, it was never taken away through termination. In fact, there is text in the Termination Act that it wasn't meant to take away those treaty rights. So they survived termination, and prior to being federally recognized in 1986, there were the court cases, Kimball versus Callaghan and Kimball 2, where the state said, you're basically out, you come under our law now. You can't do what you did traditionally. That went clear through to the Supreme Court that we do have those rights. We retain those rights to hunt, fish, trap, and gather free of state and federal regulation, and that survived termination. And it also, that right was a tribal right. It was an individual right. The state tried to argue that, in essence, if you were a 1954 member when the tribe was terminated, you have that right. But when you die, that right dies with you. The tribes argued that, no, it's the tribal right. We can continue to enroll tribal members and exercise that right forever. And that was Kimball 2, and that was affirmed. In the 70s, the Adair case, United States versus Adair, that case which ended in 1979, that because we do have a treaty right, we have a right to water to provide for sufficient water that would provide for the fish, wildlife, plants like wokus and other things. We have a right to keep that water in stream to provide for those resources. So what good's a treaty right if you don't have the resources to exercise that right on? So that principle was affirmed, and that's the Adair case. And that's why, despite termination and loss of the reservation lands, we still have a right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather. We have a water right to provide for those resources.
With water rights in place for the Klamath tribes, let's talk a little bit about how we got here. Everyone's aware that we're entering into a major drought. We're expecting a pretty severe drought this summer. Anytime that we don't get a lot of snow in the winter, people start to get nervous. And there's a lot of factors involved. It's economic. No denying agriculture is a huge part of the economy in Southern Oregon. There's environmental, as Mark's going to detail for us, problems in terms of water quality. And if a species goes extinct, we're not getting it back. And there's also cultural aspects too that we need to take into account. So could you kind of give us a basic synopsis of just how did we get to this point?
Well, after the Adair case, the state started Klamath Basin adjudication, which there are other parts of Oregon that they've already gone through the adjudication, which means they've determined who has the priority date to water in the amounts and the points of diversion and so forth. They initiated that process in the Klamath Basin here. So it was the courts affirmed that we had a right to water, and there were some other conditions that were mentioned there. But it's for an in-stream right to keep the water in-stream, to provide for those resources. So it started that process. Each of the folks that claimed a water right entered into the Klamath Basin adjudication process and filed claims, and with points of diversion and amounts, and explained where the reaches are and what would actually be irrigated. That was brought into the system. All the parties in the basin made a claim to water. So we went through a state administrative phase of the adjudication where the parties filed. Developed our claims using the methodologies, and it's kind of an interesting thing. It was because of that trust relationship that the federal government has to the tribes for basically the land that we ceded to them. They were to look out for our interests. So we had this really unique situation where the federal government has this trust obligation, and they have to assist us in the adjudication process to protect our treaty rights. So they hired consultants, they coordinated with us as much as possible, and we actually filed parallel claims into the adjudication based on the best available science or the methodology they felt was most appropriate to use to establish lake levels for the lake, flow amounts for various times and seasons and life stages of the species, even flow amounts that would help maintain stream health, what folks have referred to as the flood flows. But so it's more than just sufficient water for fish, but it's for ecosystem health and for plants and all those species that are important to the tribes and basically are representative of a healthy ecosystem. So we brought that into the process. The state adjudicator, when it came out of that state process in 2013, we have what's called determined claims. and they're not a court-decreed water right that stands forever at that point, but we have determined claims, and those are now enforceable by the state of Oregon. Enforcement started to occur that year and brought some of the difficulties there. But it's all, our water right is based on an in-stream flow. We realize it's in conflict with some of the diversions and some of the other consumptive uses. So right away we're pitted against those consumptive users. So.
Well, let's get our scientist in here to explain just what it is that we're dealing with water calls, the reasoning behind why they're made, the biological opinion that it's based on. Could you detail the specific fish that are trying to be protected and the methods that go about doing that?
With regards to the biological opinion, Bureau Reclamation project, a federal project which manages the water in the Upper Klamath Basin, with their management, if they have any impact on endangered species or their habitat, they're required to go through a process under the Endangered Species Act, which is basically Section 7 consultation under the Endangered Species Act, which results in a biological opinion. The biological opinion evaluates the effects of the irrigation project on the endangered species and their habitat, looking at impacts both to habitat and the health of the fish. With the biological opinion, there has to be a determination that minimizes the effects to the endangered species and their habitat. During an analysis of the project operations and the effects, if it is determined that has very harmful effects on the species or their habitat, usually the determination is a jeopardy biological opinion with specific reasonable and prudent alternatives which allow the project to continue but requires non-discretionary actions that need to be accomplished to protect the fish and minimize impacts. In this particular area, the Klamath project overlays the primary habitat of the two endangered suckers, the Lost River and short-nosed sucker, or Chwam and Koptu. Most of the reservoirs, water storage reservoirs, not only Upper Klamath Lake, but Clear Lake and Gerber, Tule Lake, all of the project reservoirs are habitat for these species. Significant impacts of management, water management on these species. And so a number of measures, activities need to be accomplished to minimize the effects to these fish and try to lead to actions that improve their status and lead them towards recovery. In the past, one of the key sticking points has been related to lake level management in the various reservoirs. This year, in particular, the Upper Klamath Lake, which is one of the primary habitats for the Lost River and short-nosed sucker. We have a situation where even though the species have been listed since 1988, and there's been many biological opinions over the years that have attempted to minimize impacts to the fish and actually lead towards improvement in their populations. But none of those opinions or actions that have taken place have arrested the decline of these species in Upper Klamath Lake. The current status of the suckers in the Upper Klamath Lake is quite dire. Most of the fish are 20 to 25 years old. Average life expectancy of 30 to 40 years. We have not seen a significant recruitment event, which means fish that survive to reach maturity in 20 years. We are worried that if we don't have a recruitment event in the next few years, we could see an extinction event.
So, Don, with the threat of extinction, I'm curious culturally for Klamath tribes the importance of these endangered species.
The Chwam, Koptu, and Yen, the Lost River, short nose, and the large-scale suckers have been very important to the subsistence and basically the existence of our people through the ages. Pretty reliable fish source for us through time. Of course, the salmon were important too, but the suckers in the lake have been important subsistence species. Native people, their cultures and traditions, because of our close ties to the land and use of the resources, obviously those are, it's a part of our culture. Also, because of the importance of the fish, we've had a ceremony that we conducted and reinstituted back in early 1990. Our leaders at the time would meet, and actually there was men that conducted this ceremonies. We'd come together, pray for the return of the fish, perform the ceremonies, and there was a lot of other activities associated with that. But there was even cremation as a part of the ceremony, cremation of the fish. In some respects, similar to like an Old Testament first fruits offering. I've had people look at it that way. Some of the folks that struggle with traditional tribal ceremonies, that's interesting to point that out at least, that it's not so radical or far-fetched or out there. But our people are connected to the land, are spiritually minded, and we believe in a creator, and we believe that all the resources that are out there are created there, placed them there for us, to be stewards over and to use wisely. Then there's we're taught many things through our legends and stories. There's a story about the creation of the suckers, how created basically took something that was terrible and turned it into something good and created the suckers. Without getting into the legend, which we pretty much tell every year at our Return to Schwam ceremony, which is open to the public in about the third week in March. I share this often. I did live away for a time. My parents divorced, and I lived with my non-native side of the family for a while. When I came back in 1969, my dad was a hunter and a fisherman. He grew up doing those things. He was recognized as a hunter and fisherman. And he fished for not only his family, but elders and other people in the community. So, and he was a pretty avid trout fisherman at that time. And when I moved back in 1969. But I remember when he took me and my brother back out to the river, when my brother and I moved back with him, he wanted us to be Indians. That's really how he said it. He wanted to teach us to do what we need to be doing, to serve our people and live in our community. So he took us out fishing, and we caught suckers, we caught trout, we took fish to people in the community and elders. Because we firmly believe that Creator placed those fish for us, and we used them for thousands of years. In order to be the people that Creator intended us to be, we need to be able to do that again. And I like to relate this personally, and I share it often, and I know many of our tribal members have similar stories. But when I moved back to live with my father, I was 14 and turned 15, and I was trying to find my way, find my place in the community, and find out my purpose. And I was kind of struggling a little bit. That was one of the reasons why my mom wanted to move back with my father. Just taking the fish to the elders and sharing the fish with them, I learned a lot. I learned about what should be important. I learned what was important to our people, and there was a real affirmation of who I am. I learned about my family, learned about the way that they served our community, and so I learned what was important. So I would say much of who I am and my worldview and how I turned out as an individual was really shaped by those elders and taking the fish to them. They were moral, kind, giving, loving people, and I absorbed all that, but I also found that I had a place and I had a purpose in my own community, and hunting and fishing and doing those things that my dad taught me are admirable and important things that our people did over the ages. So there is that cultural tie and that opportunity for exchanging our cultural views and values when we practice doing the things that we did for thousands of years. So when I think of that, I think of our young people that have never had that opportunity. I see some of our young people struggling maybe to find their place in the community. So without having that opportunity, I see some of our young people kind of gravitate. Even I see some of our folks listening to hip hop music and can kind of relate to the inner city black culture, and that's not everyone, but there is kind of that thing that's there. And I just, without the fish and without being able to hunt fish and do the things that we have done over the ages, I think we're losing opportunities to raise our children and keep our children in a good way. So I think that's important. And I did want to say, we know that it's a difficult situation here, what's going on in our community. And what I'm sharing with you just really hit home to me, after the 2001 water shut off. There was kind of in a matter-of-fact way, people were saying there's going to be a devastating impact to the agriculture community, if the water shut off and they can't farm, and they would say things like, but it's more than just an economic impact. When things happen to people, you take away their livelihood, their ability to be productive, their ability to take care of their families, the ability to basically live in a good way, and that's disrupted, you can expect some terrible things to happen. We'll see a rise in alcoholism, domestic abuse, suicide, and we saw some of those things after 2001. But those are some of the things that we've suffered through the ages, and we had many tragic things happen to us. If you can relate to the 2001 water shut off and think that we've gone through really similar and maybe even more devastating things and didn't have people come to our help, so that's affected our people. So as we're trying to move forward and look to the future of our people, being able to be the people that God, our Creator, intended us to be able to hunt, fish, trap, gather, exercise our culture is a big part of our healing. So if those fish aren't there, there's going to be a big hole. Something is significant would be missing.
So, Mark, we've seen a drastic decline in population of these species. What, based on your background and experience in working in this realm, do you think is the cause of that, and what actions are being done to try to address it?
Chwam and Koptu are a long-lived species. They have evolved in a situation where they can go periods of time without successful reproduction and recruitment. The current situation, they have had basically no recruitment in a long period of time. We would expect with these species that we should have a good recruitment event every few years. Since we haven't had one in 20, 25 years, there's some serious environmental concerns. With the Upper Klamath Lake situation, what we've determined is that there's very few fish surviving the first year of life. We see adequate spawning and larval fish that are produced that enter Upper Klamath Lake, but year after year, the investigation studies done by various researchers have documented rapid decline of those young fish to where by the end of the season you have very few survivors, and that has been occurring year after year for 20 plus years. What appears to be going on is not one particular thing. Poor water quality in Upper Klamath Lake during the summer is a major driver of the poor survival of the fish, the young fish. What happens is when you get poor water quality conditions, the fish become stressed, have a higher risk of disease, parasites. They are impacted by predators. There's a significant population of both bird and fish predators, and there's non-native fish that were introduced that are now very dominant in Upper Klamath Lake. Algal toxins. So there's many factors that are having an impact on the survival of these fish. What appears to be a key element is the water quality in Klamath Lake. Klamath Lake is naturally a very productive system. It's shallow, had high natural levels of nutrients that supported large algae blooms. But with some of the development that has occurred over actually over a century of both agricultural timber harvest and wetland draining. That has resulted in a major increase in the amount of sediment and nutrients, plant nutrients, that have entered Klamath Lake. As a result of those changes, the water quality impacted primarily by algal blooms. The blue-green algae occurs in such high abundances that it has a drastic effect on water quality, oxygen, the pH, ammonia. When you have these extraordinary algal blooms every year during this summer period, when you have these small fish in Klamath Lake, that is impacting their survival. And unfortunately, there's no easy solution for that. Over the long term, we need significant habitat restoration in the watershed. Wetland restoration, riparian restoration will, over time, improve the condition of the lake and the water quality. What we are doing presently, the only short-term tool that we have that we believe will be helpful in protecting the fish, increasing survival, is with the lake level management. The Klamath Tribes has been involved in water quality studies on Klamath Lake for over 25 years. Over that time period, there's been a lot of very good information to base our current position, where we believe that the lake levels that are required in the biological opinion are not sufficient, and that we have recommended higher levels to mitigate for some of the degraded conditions in the watershed. We believe, at least in the short term, with the fish in such dire condition, that is what is necessary to help protect the fish.
Don, we hear a lot, the Klamath Tribes made a call on water, and everyone assumes it's the tribes that are doing that. But what is it that determines when a call is made? What agencies and factors are involved, and what happens after that? What's the domino effect?
Yes, we are making calls on water, to satisfy our current claims, basically to meet the needs of the fish species that our claims were developed for. We make the call just so we can have the fish protected and the resources necessary. The state is the agency that enforces that. So when we make the call, and we do have a year-round water right, when we make the call, and it's a proactive. If we didn't, it's complaint driven. If we didn't make the call, there wouldn't be regulation. So we are making the call to our determined claim levels. The state regulates, but they regulate by priority date. There's individuals that are folks have this misconception that somehow when we make a call, it's directed on some and not others. We don't have the ability. We can't make what's called a select call. We can't say regulate these folks and don't regulate those others. That's evident by the fact that many of our offices and tribal members live in the Chilliquin area. When we made a call on the Williamson and Sprague rivers, because the well that serves Chilliquin is within within a mile of the river, it's subjected to a regulation because there's a hydrologic connection there. So we made a call to satisfy our water claims, and Chilliquin was subjected to regulation because the governor made a drought declaration this year, and which allowed the state to develop drought provisions. The city of Chilliquin made a request, for water and that to be considered in the drought provisions, which not only provided for stock water, but water for human consumption, cooking, and sanitation. So we're currently limited to that in the city of Chilliquin. We are responsible for making the call to protect our resources, but the state of Oregon has to regulate according to the state statutes in the prior appropriations doctrine, which is first in time, first in right. And as folks know, because we were here first, we have a time immemorial water right. So our priority date to water is superior to anybody else in the basin.
Well, what do you think are some of the misunderstandings or misconceptions associated with Klamath Tribes right now regarding water? There's a lot of nerves and tension associated with a lot of farmers and ranchers. What do you think people don't understand about the process behind determining a water call that maybe they should?
Yeah, see, because we developed our claims and we brought that into the adjudication quite a while back, it's in those claims, the amounts in the times that in locations where we have those rights, we don't really have to go through a scientific process again at this point. We basically look at the flow levels at the various reaches or the lake level. And when we're approaching that, or actually it's complaint driven, we have to actually go below our water right before the state of Oregon will actually enforce. We can't say, hey, you're getting really close now to, looks like we're on a downhill trend and you won't have enough water to satisfy our water right. We basically, when the amounts of water that we have a right to, is when it's dropping below those levels, we initiate a process, and and actually it involves the Bureau of Indian Affairs also to go through a process, and it eventually shows up to the state of Oregon, file that with the state of Oregon, then they go out and basically verify whether or not our rights are being met. Then they regulate accordingly.
So with the drought we have ongoing and with declining population trends, Mark, based on all of the extensive work that you have done on this, where do you see us going? What do you predict in terms of the future of these species and of water management in the Klamath Basin?
One of the first measures that has been taken with the realization that we are not seeing recruitment, there's been a commitment to helping the fish along. A few years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service started a rearing program to raise suckers past the bottleneck stage, basically up to about 2 years of age, about 10 inches of length. The Klamath Tribes also is participating and gearing up our program to contribute to that program. We believe that for some time into the future, the populations are going to need to be assisted with the rearing program because we can't easily improve the health of the lake and the tributaries. So that is one measure that will be needed for some time to come. One of the challenges with these species is that they don't mature until they're 5 to 10 years of age. So, it takes time before we see fish reaching maturity, or even to evaluate the success of our rearing programs. That is obviously very important. Other aspects, we're seeing a lot of cooperation in the community in terms of, for example, with the rearing programs, some of the farmers have provided their facilities. There's some geothermal wells, the lower Klamath area that supporting the Fish and Wildlife Service's rearing program. The Klamath Tribes are working with the Klamath Basin Refuges. They have provided us with some rearing ponds to help raise fish. Also, we are in cooperative efforts with the state of Oregon and agricultural producers around Upper Klamath Lake. As I mentioned, nutrient loading is a major factor contributing to poor water quality, and there are direct nutrient inputs into Upper Klamath Lake from agricultural lands around the lake. So we've had cooperation recently in working towards solutions to reducing nutrient loading with both the ag producers and the state regulatory agencies like DEQ, Oregon Department of Agriculture. So we're seeing some promising cooperation to resolve these issues. Obviously needs to be long-term, large-scale habitat restoration in the Upper Klamath Basin. There's no, easy fixes. We have done a lot of restoration. There's been a lot of wetland restored. One of the big restoration projects that was completed was at the Williamson River Delta, about 10 years ago. And that is a critical area for young fish coming down the Williamson to rear. And projects like that have made a contribution to the recovery. The water quality appears to be kind of overwhelming all of the good things that have been done in the basin. the fish screens, the fish ladders, the habitat restoration. A lot of things have been done and been supported by the community over the last 25 years. People are been supportive of recovering the fish. The Chwam and Koptu are indicators of ecosystem health. They're canary in the coal mine. They provide vital ecosystem functions. They help maintain the balance of the lake ecosystem. So when their populations are low, then we see things out of balance and just an unhealthy situation with the lake.
So with water quality being a major factor, just the overall demand from ranchers and farmers and for environmental impact and all that, how much of an impact would just a couple consecutive winters of good solid snowpack make in the overall process?
As I mentioned initially, the endangered suckers, their life history is patterned around kind of boom and bust. They are long-lived. They are very productive, prolific when conditions are good. So there's the potential that if we get the right combination of good hydrology, good water quality conditions in the lake, that we could see a major recruitment event. And that is really what we need, because it's been so long since we had such a condition. There's been a lot of interest in what was the conditions like during, say, 1991, the last major year when there was a major recruitment event. And, that wasn't a particularly high water year, but, some climatic conditions and just everything lined up to where the fish survived well that year and are basically providing the current fish that are remaining today came from just a couple of year classes back in the early 90s.
It doesn't sound like there's any easy solutions for any of these matters to try to find a happy balance, but what is the Klamath Tribe's goals and hopes to come out of this drought?
Well, we're hoping to do everything that we can to protect the fish from going extinct. Because of the serious situation we are in with the drought and the conditions, we're in an unfortunate position of taking steps that we believe are necessary to keep sufficient water in the lake to protect them the best we can. We don't have a lot of tools, but we can manage the lake to reduce risk to the fish and hopefully improve their survival. I think at this point it'd be helpful to just point out that folks, everywhere I go, it's in the media, in letters to the editor, commentaries, folks are looking to the Klamath Tribes as the solution. And frankly, we're backed up against the wall. We don't have any flexibility to do anything different than what we're calling for this year. It's difficult for our community, and hopefully folks won't be, I'm hoping that they're going to understand why we're doing what we're doing, not trying to cause harm, but as you mentioned earlier, if the fish are gone, they're gone forever. And, the responsibility of our tribal council is pretty clear what our Constitution provides and charges us with. And it's our responsibility as a tribal council to protect our treaty resources and so forth. And as the chairman of the tribe, that's my role in terms of communicating to the community. That's one of my responsibilities, to represent the tribes to the external entities and internally in the tribes. So I'm sharing just where we're at. It's a difficult position that we're in, and we basically don't have any options to do anything differently. And no, it's difficult, but we have to protect the fish.
Well, water is kind of the first thing that everyone's talking about right now, but that's not the only thing that's going on with Klamath Tribes. We've talked plenty about dealing with endangered species and water levels and all that, but I know there's other things there's always upcoming events going on with Klamath Tribes. I know there's been extensive construction going on by the casino of a new hotel. Can you give us a general update of what's going on with Klamath Tribes?
Well, we are excited about building our hotel next to our casino and our travel center, our fueling station, and food stop there. We're building a hotel that's going to be opening, projected in September. We believe that'll be an asset to the community. Definitely complement our facilities that are out there. So we're really excited about that. It's coming along very well, and we're on schedule to open. I'm not sure. I've heard how many folks that we will employ, but it'll be a source of employment and hopefully help us even generate more revenue from our casino, and so that's one of the things that we're focused on. We're looking forward to our restoration celebration in August. We do that annually, and that's when we're restored back to federal recognition. We celebrate that every year and have a powwow open to the public and invite folks to come along. And we have vendors, food vendors, and people that sell beadwork and other items. And it's just a great time to get together and celebrate restoration and celebrate our community.
Aspects or areas that maybe Klamath Tribes would like to expand into they're not in right now, or issues that you're trying to work through improving?
Well, we are really, we've gone through a strategic planning process. We're going through that. The Tribal Council went through a planning process for the 3-year terms that we have, and it's been pretty extensive. So we're hoping to lay a foundation to move forward to better achieve the goals that we have. Often, a lot of our focus is just to promote the overall spiritual, physical, mental health and well-being of our tribal members. So we have our tribal health facilities. We've been working to improve services to our members there. We're taking a look at where we can be better, and serving our members and serving the community. So I'm really excited about some of the changes that are coming about. We have 2 general managers that I really believe have been a real help to us. Mr. George Lopez, who's the general manager of our tribe's administration. Shanda Aloysius Yates is the general manager of our health facilities. So we're trying to provide services and improve things for our tribal members to promote the overall health and well-being of our people. So making significant progress. And one of the other things that we've really believe that we need to do is let people know who we are. We've kept to ourselves for many, many years, and certainly around these water issues, we're in the public, trying to explain our perspectives and views. But we believe the community needs to know who we are and what we bring to the community. We're one of the larger employers in Klamath County, and we employ tribal members and non-tribal members. We do want to provide jobs to all of our tribal members and opportunities there. So we do have Indian preference or tribal preference policy. There's a lot of funds that comes through the tribes. We secure a lot of services, spend a lot of money here. So those are things that we want people to know. There's a lot of misinformation. I don't know how many times I've heard over the years that we don't pay taxes, and I've heard some real recent negative posts, that we're basically on some kind of a welfare state, and we're providing it and paying for it, or us taxpayers are paying everything for you guys. For not really understanding that we pay taxes too. I own property, I pay taxes, I pay federal and state taxes, and our tribal members do. So there's a real need for people to know who we are. So we're trying to take a look at what we can do to tell our story and let people know who we are and what our long-term goals and desires are. And we're not going away. We're a big part of this community. Obviously, termination is, if you were to study the history, it was one of the most devastating things that happened not only to our Klamath people, but to the economy of the region. When we had a reservation here, even though we weren't paying, because it was reservation land, we weren't paying taxes off that reservation, we were generating local jobs. We had a lot of non-tribal members working in our mills, working out in the woods, providing services to our tribal members. Probably one of the most stable economic times in our basin is when the Klamath Tribes had a significant reservation and had our operations there. We believe that same thing is true. If we could be supported in land return, which we believe we could do a really good job of managing the land to provide for the multiple resources that once provide economic opportunity, but hopefully we could heal the system. It'd be better for the hydrology, better for the deer populations, better for everybody if that land was returned. So that's a significant goal of ours, to have a land base and once again be economically self-sufficient. I always like to take the opportunity to share that. So that's a goal and vision of ours also.
We have been speaking with Don Gentry, Klamath Tribes Chairman, and Mark Buettner, Klamath Tribes Scientist. Gentlemen, thank you so much for educating us about the current water issues and drought situation and endangered species and everything that's going on with Klamath Tribes. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to teach us all about this.
Great. We thank you for the opportunity. Glad to be here.